I sat at my kitchen table with my late husband's recipe box open in front of me, and I thought about how a tin box full of index cards had nearly ended up in a dumpster behind a rented event hall. Because my daughter-in-law decided it clashed with her color scheme. Because here's what she said when she held it up in front of 40 people and a professional photographer. "This is sweet, but we're going for a modern aesthetic." And here's what she didn't know she was holding when she said it. Stay with me to the end. Welcome to Strong Mom Stories. I'm Nadine Calloway. I'm 64 years old, and for 31 years, I ran a small catering business out of a commercial kitchen I rented by the week on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. I cooked for church suppers and retirement parties, and the kind of backyard weddings where the bride's mother cries the whole time, and the groom's mother pretends she isn't. I know food the way some people know music. I can taste a sauce and tell you what's missing before I've swallowed it. And I can tell you what a meal is worth by something that has nothing to do with the menu price. My hands still work, thank God, though my knees have opinions about standing for 6 hours that I didn't ask for. I say that not to complain, but so you understand what it meant when I spent 4 months making something by hand for my son's new baby, and what it cost me, and why I did it anyway. People look at a woman my age and they see a sweet grandmother with a casserole dish. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that, harmless, a little behind the times. I let her, because I learned a long time ago that being underestimated is its own kind of advantage. But I spent 31 years feeding people through the hardest days of their lives, and I know what lasts. I know what doesn't. And I knew the night my son called me, his voice completely undone, that the woman he'd married had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. Let me start where it starts. With Walt. My husband Walt passed away 22 months before our granddaughter's christening. 40 years of marriage, and then a February morning at Ohio Health Riverside, and then a house that suddenly had too many rooms. Walt was not a complicated man. He drove a Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles on it and wore the pair of work boots for 8 years. He coached Little League for 12 seasons and never once kept score in a way that made any child feel bad. He was the kind of man who noticed when the teenager bagging groceries looked like she hadn't eaten and paid for her lunch without making a thing of it. But Walt was a planner, not about money exactly, or not only about money. He was a planner about people. He thought in generations the way farmers think about seasons, always considering what the ground would need long after he was done tending it. When our son Kevin was about 8 years old, Walt started putting things in the recipe box. I need to explain the recipe box first. It was his mother's, a red tin box with white flowers painted on the lid, slightly dented on one corner from some long ago fall, with 300 index cards inside in her handwriting. Pot roast, apple butter, the yeast rolls she made every Thanksgiving that Kevin still talks about. Walt's mother, Opal, died when Kevin was 3, too young for him to remember her well. Walt used to say that box was the closest thing he had left to hearing his mother's voice. He kept it on the kitchen counter his whole life. I never moved it. What I didn't know, until Walt told me the month before he died, was that he'd been slipping things into the box for years, tucked between the recipe cards, flat against the bottom of the tin. Savings bonds, the old paper kind, bought quietly every year. I-bonds, E-bonds, a few Series HH, every Christmas bonus. Every good year. He'd started. The year Kevin turned 8, he told me, because that was the year Kevin brought home a little girl from school in a crayon drawing and announced she was going to be his wife. Walt figured someday there'd be grandchildren. He wanted to make sure those grandchildren started out with something. I asked him to show me. He described where they were. Behind Opal's biscuit recipe, rubber-banded with a note in his handwriting that said, "For the grandchildren. With love from Walt." He'd never told me. 37 years of marriage, and I didn't know that tin box held anything but food. He told me the amount. I'll spare you the suspense the way I spared Kevin. It was just over $62,000, $62,400 and some change, from a man who drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it and bought his boots on sale. Then he told me what he wanted done with it, and this is the part I think about every single day. "Don't just hand Kevin an envelope," he said. His voice was thin by then, but his eyes were clear. He was always clearest when he was being most serious. Money in an envelope goes fast. People spend it before they've thought about it. You hide those bonds in something they'll keep, something they'll look at every day. And when the time comes, you put it in front of them, and you make them find it themselves. You make it mean something, Nadine. Don't let it just be a check. He squeezed my hand. I said, "What should I hide it in?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "In the box, Nadine. Where else would I put it? It's already in the box." And then he smiled, the Walt smile, the crooked one that still got me after 40 years. And he said, "Put a good recipe on top so nobody goes looking too soon." He died 11 days later. I put his recipe box on the counter next to mine, and I left it there. Kevin and his wife Jessa had been trying for a baby for 2 years by then. When the news finally came, 6 months after Walt's funeral, I stood in my kitchen, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the hospital. Because Walt had been so certain. He'd been certain for 37 years, and he'd been right. The baby was due in the spring. A girl. They were naming her Lily, after Jessa's grandmother. I started planning how I would give them the box. I want to be honest with you about Jessa, because I don't want her to be a flat character in her own story. She's more than the woman who almost threw away $62,000. She grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati in a family that had very specific ideas about how things should look. Her mother, Diane, is the kind of woman who says the word presentation the way other people say prayer. Jessa was raised to curate. The house she and Kevin bought looks like a magazine page, everything coordinated, everything intentional, every object chosen because it fits the story she's telling about herself and her life. I don't think she's malicious. I think she's frightened. Frightened the way her mother taught her to be. That if something doesn't match, if something looks cheap or old or out of place, it reflects on her somehow, makes her less. That's a sad way to live. I tried to have compassion for it. But compassion and trust are different things, and Walt's $62,000 was not something I was willing to hand to a household that valued presentation above everything else. Not as a check, not loose. It needed to be given the way Walt intended. Hidden inside something they'd keep, something that would make them slow down and actually find it. So I decided the christening was the moment. I cleaned the recipe box. I polished the tin until the white flowers showed up again. I sorted through Opal's cards one more time, reading her handwriting, smelling the ghost of vanilla and wood smoke that still somehow lived in the paper. I took out the bonds and donned the note, "For the grandchildren, with love from Walt," and I added something of my own. A letter I'd written over 3 evenings at my kitchen table. A letter to little Lily from her grandpa Walt, translated through me. The things he'd told me about himself, the stories he'd have told her himself if he'd had the chance, the values that drove a quiet Ohio man to tuck away $62,000 over 37 years for a grandchild he never got to meet. I put it all back in the box, behind the biscuit recipe, just like he'd kept it. I put one of my own recipes on top. My French onion soup, which Kevin has loved since he was 9 years old, so if anyone opened the box casually, they'd see food and move on. I wrapped it in brown paper tied with kitchen twine, because Walt would have laughed at a bow. The christening was held at St. Anthony's in Powell, Ohio, followed by a reception at a rented venue called the Linden House. Jessa had planned it the way she plans everything, meticulously, beautifully, and with a very clear aesthetic, white and gold. Peonies. A calligrapher had addressed the invitations. There was a candy bar and a photo booth and a banner above the gift table that said Lily Grace in script. I arrived with my brown paper package and felt immediately that I had not gotten the memo. The gift table was a display. That's the word for it. The presents were arranged like a boutique, tags facing out, ribbons coordinated, the whole thing clearly part of the photo plan. A professional photographer moved around the room catching candids that were not quite candid. I set my package on the table and felt the slight, invisible flinch of the woman arranging gifts, just a flicker of something when she saw the brown paper. Kevin's aunt, Patricia, was there, Walt's younger sister, warm and sharp, and the one person in that room besides me who had loved Walt without reservation. She found me near the windows and held my arm for a moment. "The box," she said quietly. "I heard you were bringing it," Kevin told her. They were close, Kevin and Patricia. She'd been helping me sort through Walt's belongings after the funeral, and I'd shown her what was in the box. She was the only one who knew. "Is he ready for this?" she asked. "I don't think he knows what's in it," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Kevin doesn't know?" I shook my head. "Walt kept it from everyone. I only found out at the end. Kevin knows it's his Grandma Opal's recipe box. He doesn't know what else is in it." Patricia looked at the brown package on the gift table. "You should tell him before she opens it," she said, "so he knows to watch." I shook my head. Walt's instructions were specific. Make them find it. Let them discover it themselves. I'll just be sure to tell Jessa about the false bottom after she opens the lid. Patricia looked at me with an expression I would understand better later. "Nadine," she said, "what if she doesn't open it?" I didn't have a good answer for that. In 40 years of living, I had never once met someone who received a gift and did not open it. I would meet one that afternoon. The gift opening happened at the tables, after lunch. Diane had appointed herself the gift announcer, which meant she stood beside Jessa's chair reading each tag aloud while the photographer circled, and Jessa's friend, Amber, captured everything on a phone propped on a little tripod. The gifts were what you'd expect from that table. A monogrammed cashmere blanket from a boutique downtown, a silver spoon set, an engraved picture frame, a stroller attachment that Diane announced the brand name of, as though she were introducing a celebrity. Jessa held each item up toward Amber's phone, thanked the giver by name, and moved on. It was gracious, it was efficient, and it was entirely, completely about the object's visible value. Then Diane picked up my package. She read the tag, "From Grandma Nadine." And then, because the paper was brown and the twine was plain, and there was no curling ribbon, she said, in the voice she would use for a child's drawing, "Oh, how charming. The homemade touch." Several people said, "Ah," in the way that means they are not really listening. Jessa took the package. She looked at the brown paper. Something moved across her face, that same invisible flinch, and she smiled the smile that means the performance is still running. She pulled the twine. She opened the paper. The box sat in her hands. She looked at it. A dented red tin with white flowers. Opal's box. Kevin's grandmother's recipe box that had sat on our kitchen counter for 40 years, and I watched her face, in that one moment, make a decision. She opened the lid. Just barely. Just enough to see the index card on top with my handwriting. French onion soup. And no logo, no brand, no price tag, nothing that could be assessed for its social worth. And she closed the lid. She didn't go through the cards. She didn't feel along the bottom. She lifted the box once, politely, toward Amber's phone, and she said, "Kevin's mom sent the family recipe box." That's so sentimental. And Diane said, "Bless her heart. You'll have to find a spot for that." And then Jessa set it on the table behind her, on top of the torn wrapping paper, with the other things she'd finished with. Not in a trash can. I want to be accurate. She didn't throw it away dramatically. She just set it down, finished with it. The way you set down a church bulletin after the service, politely, without cruelty, and with the absolute certainty that you will never look at it again. I had a choice in that moment. I had planned, in my head, to catch Jessa's eye gently after she opened the lid and say, "Sweetheart, there's something special inside. Feel along the bottom." But she had moved on so quickly. The next gift was already in Diane's hands. The room had moved with her, and I sat across the table and I made myself breathe. I thought of Walt. Make them find it. Make it mean something. He hadn't said anything about the possibility that she wouldn't even look. I waited until the gifts were done. I waited until Diane was across the room with a glass of Prosecco, and I went to Jessa and I touched her arm. I said quietly, "There's something else in the recipe box, underneath the cards. Walt left something for the baby. I'd love to show you when you have a moment." Jessa looked at me. Her smile was warm and immediate and 100% glass. "Oh, that's so sweet," she said. "We'll definitely go through everything when we're home and settled. Kevin will love having all those recipes." and she turned to greet someone who had just arrived. I picked up the recipe box from the discard table. I put it in my bag, and I went to find Patricia. She was watching me from across the room. She'd seen all of it. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and I held the recipe box on my lap. I didn't cry. I'd done my crying for Walt, and I didn't have extra. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than sadness. It was the particular feeling of watching someone stand in front of something precious and genuinely not see it. Not because they're evil, because they've never been taught how to look. And I thought about Walt, who had bought savings bonds in off years when the money was thin, who had tucked them behind his mother's biscuit recipe with a note that said, "For the grandchildren," who had trusted that the grandchildren would end up in a house that knew how to look. I thought, he was wrong about the house. He was right about the grandchild. Because Lily was innocent of all of this. Lily was 3 weeks old and had nothing to do with presentation or aesthetics or what goes on Amber's phone. Lily deserved her grandfather's $62,000 and his letter exactly as Walt intended. So I drove home, and I started thinking like someone who had spent 31 years making sure things that mattered were handled correctly, even when the people around the table weren't paying attention. My phone rang before I reached my neighborhood. It was Patricia, Nadine. She sounded tight. "Kevin just found me. He saw you take the box. He asked where his mother's gift was. I told him I had it. I said there was something special inside, and I wanted to make sure it was handled carefully." Nadine, Patricia paused. "I think I made a mistake." I was so unsettled watching Jessa put it aside. When Kevin came over to me, I said Walt had left something in that box for the baby. Something important. I said it before I thought. I closed my eyes. He didn't know what was in it, and I just told him. I heard her exhale. How did he react? "He went white," she said. "He asked me how much. I told him." He sat down. He's still sitting. I don't think he's moved. I thanked her. I hung up, and I understood that somewhere in that event hall, my son was doing the arithmetic of what had just happened in front of him, of what he'd let happen, of what sitting quietly at a christening and choosing not to make a fuss about a recipe box had almost cost. I put the kettle on. I knew he would call. He called in 4 minutes. "Mom." His voice had the particular sound of a man who has been holding himself together through something and is no longer sure he can't. "Mom, please tell me you have it." "I have it, Kevin. It's on my table." I heard him breathe. A long, unsteady breath. He said, "Aunt Patricia told me. She told me about the bonds. About Dad. I know. How much of it did she? Is it all still there?" "Every bond. The note. The letter I wrote for Lily. All of it." He was quiet. Then he said, "Mom, what was inside that box? Tell me all of it. From the beginning." And I told him. I told him about the hospital room, about Walt showing me what was behind the biscuit recipe, about 37 years of Christmas bonuses and good months and patient accumulation. I told him $62,400 saved by a man who drove the same truck for 11 years and never once complained about it. And I told him about the letter, about Walt dictating it to me in the evenings that last week, pausing between sentences, making me read it back, wanting to make sure every word was right, because he knew he only had the one chance to introduce himself to a grandchild he'd never meet. Kevin was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "I saw her set it aside. I saw her pick up the next gift. And I didn't say anything, Mom. I just sat there. I know. I thought he stopped. I thought, it's just a recipe box. Don't make a scene. It'll upset Diane." And then he made a sound that I recognized from when he was 7 years old and had broken something and knew it. I knew it was just a recipe box. I knew what it meant to you. And I just let her put it in the done pile because I didn't want a thing. Some things a son needs to say out loud without being rescued from it. I let him sit with it. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Tell me what you want." "I want one thing," I said. "I want the whole family in the same room. You, Jessa, Diane if she'll come, and Patricia. And I want to give Lily her grandfather's gift properly. Out loud where everyone understands what it is." He said, "When?" I said, "Sunday dinner. My house." He said, "I'll make sure everyone is there." He told Jessa that night. I wasn't there for it, but he told me about it later, and Jessa told me her version, and the two versions, the way versions always do, revealed the people telling them. Kevin's version. He sat her down at the kitchen table and told her calmly that the recipe box she'd set aside at the christening contained $62,000 in savings bonds from his father and a letter his father had dictated on his deathbed for Lily. Jessa's first words were not, "I'm sorry." They were not, "Oh my God, is it safe?" They were, "Well, how was anyone supposed to know that? Who puts money in a recipe box? That's not a normal thing. Your mom should have said something. Your mom should have said something." I've turned that sentence over many times. And what I've come to is this. Jessa was not wrong that I could have said something. I could have warned her. But Jessa's first instinct, her very first instinct, was not grief or remorse or even surprise. It was to locate the person responsible, and that person was me. She had set aside a dead man's final gift without looking, and within 30 seconds, she had found the angle where she was the reasonable party. That told me what I needed to know about how to handle the $62,000. I didn't lock it away out of cruelty. I locked it away because a household that responds to nearly discarding a grandfather's life savings with your mother-in-law should have said something is not a household you hand an open inheritance to. I called my friend Roberta, who is an estate attorney in Worthington, on Monday morning. I'd known her for 20 years. I laid out the situation on her kitchen table over coffee. She did not seem surprised. She did not tell me I was being unreasonable. She helped me set up an education trust for Lily. A real one. The bonds would be redeemed and the money would go into the trust, administered by a third-party trustee, directed toward Lily's education and her start in life. It could not be withdrawn, borrowed against, or redirected by either parent. Not by Jessa. Not by Kevin. The money was Walt's promise to Lily, and it would find its way to Lily on its own track, through an institution that didn't have opinions about presentation or color schemes or what goes on Amber's phone. It cost me something to lock Kevin out too. He knew it. He didn't argue. Then I planned Sunday dinner. I made the pot roast. You make pot roast when the conversation is going to be hard, because the smell of it fills the house and it gives everyone something real and grounding to sit around. I set the table properly. Good dishes. Not fussy, just good. And in the center of the table, where a centerpiece would go, I put the recipe box. They arrived the way people arrive to Sunday dinners they know are not ordinary. Kevin, quiet and careful, carrying Lily. Jessa, polished and watchful. Diane, who had come because not coming would have meant accepting the implication. Patricia, who arrived early and stood in my kitchen for 20 minutes not saying anything, just being there. We ate first. I insisted on that. You do the hard thing after food. We talked about Lily, about Kevin's job, about how the weather had finally turned. Diane complimented my pot roast, and I thanked her, and for 20 minutes it was almost pleasant. Then I cleared the plates. I sat back down and I put my hand on the recipe box in the center of the table. "I'd like to give Lily her grandfather's gift now," I said, "the way Walt asked me to give it." The table went still. "Jessa," I said, and I kept my voice even and not unkind. "You held this box at the christening. You looked at it and decided what it was and put it aside without going through it. I'd like to show you, and everyone here, what you were actually holding." I took out the small knife I use for opening mail. I worked it along the false seam at the bottom of the tin, the one Walt had crafted himself years ago before he started filling it. And I lifted the false bottom out in one piece. The bonds were underneath, rubber banded, organized by year, the way Walt did everything. "These," I said, setting the stack on the table, "are U.S. savings bonds. Walt bought them for his grandchild. A little at a time, every Christmas bonus, every good year, for 37 years. He started in 1987, the year Kevin turned 8. I smoothed them flat. They are worth $62,416. The number moved through the room like a change in air pressure. Diane's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Jessa went the color of the tablecloth. "And this," I said, setting down the envelope, "is the last letter Walt ever wrote. He dictated it to me in the hospital." It's for Lily to be opened on her 18th birthday so that someday a young woman who never got to meet her grandfather can sit down and hear from him anyway. I touched the envelope. Walt's exact words to me were, "Don't let it just be a check. Hide it in something they'll keep. Make them find it. Make it mean something." I looked at Jessa. "This is what you held at the christening. This is what you put aside because the paper was brown and the bow was kitchen twine and there was no brand name on the tag. Nobody moved." Jessa did what I had come to understand was her nature. She reached for the version where the harm had happened to her. She said, "That's not fair. I didn't know. You can't expect me to know that." She gestured at the bonds, "Was in a recipe box. That's not a reasonable thing to assume. If it was that important, someone should have told me." "Someone was trying to," I said, my voice steady. "I came to you at the christening after you set the box down. I told you there was something special inside. You told me you'd go through it when you were home and settled." That was the last I heard. She blinked. There was a pause that I think surprised her more than anything I'd said, because she had, I believe, genuinely forgotten that moment. It had not registered as significant. It had registered as the kind of thing a mother-in-law says that you absorb and move on from. Like a piece of mail you put on the counter meaning to read later and never do. That forgetting is the whole of it, really. Not malice, not deliberate cruelty. Just the particular blindness of a woman who has spent her life moving through rooms with a very clear idea of what matters and an efficient system for setting aside anything that doesn't match. Diane opened her mouth. She said, "I think we can all agree this situation was—" "Diane," Kevin said. Just one word, her name. But in a voice she had not heard from her son-in-law before, a voice that had some weight in it, a voice that was done choosing easier. Diane closed her mouth. Kevin looked at me. His eyes were red at the edges. He said, "Tell them what you decided." "About the trust." I told them. I was clear and I was not cruel about it. The money was going into an education trust, administered independently, directed to Lily's schooling and her start in life. Neither parent could access it, redirect it, or touch it. It was Walt's promise to his granddaughter, and it would find her when she was old enough to use it, as Walt intended. Jessa absorbed this. Her jaw tightened. I could see her calculating what objecting would cost her. She said nothing. Kevin nodded. One slow nod, the nod of a man who had known this was coming and had decided not to fight it, because he understood that he had earned the locking out by sitting quietly at a round table in a rented event hall while his father's last gift was set on a discard pile. "And the letter," I said, "stays sealed until Lily is 18. Walt wrote it for her, not for us. We don't get to read it just because we're impatient or because we think we've paid enough into this afternoon to deserve it." Patricia made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Then I said the thing I had been saving. Walt also wrote a few sentences for this moment. He didn't know this particular moment would look like this, but he asked me to read it aloud on the day the family learned about the gift. So here we are. I took the small envelope from my cardigan pocket. I had been carrying it for weeks. I opened it. My hands were steady, though I don't entirely know why. I read, "If you're hearing this, then the baby has finally arrived, and I am sorry I couldn't make it there in person to be a nuisance. I have been saving for this child since Kevin was 8 years old, not because I had money to spare. Lord knows I didn't always, but because my own grandfather did this for me, and it changed what I thought was possible. That is all I wanted to do. Change what this child thinks is possible. Spend it on something that opens a door. And please, all of you, remember that the most valuable things Opal ever gave me came in a tin box with a dented corner, and they were recipes. Everything else was gravy. All my love, Walt." The room was very quiet. Patricia was crying openly, not bothering to hide it. Kevin had his face turned into the top of Lily's sleeping head, and his shoulders were going. Jessa was looking at the recipe box, the dented corner, the white flowers, and I watched something move across her face that was not a performance. Something real. Something that might have been the beginning of actually seeing it. I folded the letter back into its envelope. I said, "I did not do this to humiliate anyone. I did it because that baby is going to grow up in your house, learning what's worth noticing and what isn't. Walt thought it was important enough to spend 37 years proving it. I think she deserves to know he did that. I rested my hand on the box. The bonds are for her future. The letter is for her heart. And this box, I want it to go home with you. But I'm keeping it until I feel certain the house it's going into has learned to look at it properly. Jessa looked up from the box. Her voice, when she found it, was smaller than I'd heard it. She said, I want to go through the recipes. If that's okay, I want to read them. I said yes. She reached across the table slowly and opened the lid. She lifted the first index card. Opal's handwriting. Buttermilk biscuits. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, can you teach me how to make these? That's where the story could end. And sometimes I wish it did, with that single question, because it was the most honest thing I'd heard Jessa say in 6 years of knowing her. But here's what actually happened after, because I know you want the truth of it, not just the turning point. The trust is locked and growing. $62,416 sitting quietly, doing exactly what Walt intended, building interest, building time, waiting for a girl who will someday need a door opened and will find it already there. Diane and I are cordial. That's the most accurate word. She does not say bless her heart to me anymore, and I do not bring up the christening, and we have reached an equilibrium that is not warmth, but is not war. Kevin changed. That's the truest thing I can tell you. Grief, and that particular shame. The shame of knowing what your silence cost. They did something to him that 40 years of keeping the peace never could. He came to my house alone about 6 weeks after the Sunday dinner and sat at my kitchen table and said, I keep going back to the christening, and I don't land on Jessa anymore. I land on myself. I saw you come to her table. I saw her set the box down. I knew it was Dad's, and I thought, don't make a thing of it. Let it go. Keep the peace. He looked at his hands. I have kept the peace my entire life, Mom, and what I've kept was a very quiet kind of nothing. I said, your father knew that about you. He loved you anyway. He nodded. He said, I'm learning to say the thing. Out loud in the room when it needs saying. I'm not good at it yet, but I'm doing it on purpose. That's new. It is new, and I'm proud of him. Better late. Walt would be too. Jessa and I have a Wednesday arrangement now. Once or twice a month, she comes to my kitchen and we cook something from Opal's box. She is not a natural cook. She is precise where she should be relaxed and relaxed where she should be precise. But she is trying, and trying matters more than aptitude when you're learning something for the first time. Last month, she made the biscuits herself. They were a little flat and not quite right, and she knew it, and she laughed at them, and the laughing was real. She keeps the recipe box on her kitchen counter now. She didn't ask me, she just did it. The first time I walked in and saw it there, I had to stand for a moment with my back to her and make sure my face was in order. Walt's tin box, his mother's recipes, his dented corner, his white flowers, his 37 years of patience sitting right there on the counter where any person walking through the kitchen could reach out and open it. I don't know if Jessa has learned to look the way Walt meant. I think she's learning to slow down, which is maybe the same thing, or close enough to start with. What I know is that someday Lily will be 18. She will open an envelope that has been waiting for her since before she could hold her own head up. And she will meet her grandfather for the first time. A quiet Ohio man who drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it and never wasted a good year and believed all the way down that the best thing you can do for a child you love is to change what they think is possible. He was right about that. He was always right about the things that lasted. My knees are worse this winter, but I'm still in my kitchen, and I've started going through Opal's box myself on slow evenings, reading each card, writing notes in the margins. What Kevin always asked for, what Walt's way of making it was, what I changed. Because someday Lily will be in a kitchen of her own, and she will have more than money waiting for her in that box. She'll have all of us. That's how it works, the old-fashioned way. You put yourself into something that lasts, and you wait for them to find you. Make them find it, Walt said. Make it mean something. I'm still working on it. I think that's the point.